My friend, can we explore together something that touches perhaps the deepest questions about human nature, individuality, and what it means to live authentically in a world that constantly pressures everyone toward conformity? Throughout his many decades of teaching and speaking to people across the world, Jiddu Krishnamurti observed certain qualities and characteristics that appear very rarely in human beings, traits that set certain individuals fundamentally apart, not because they are superior or more evolved in some hierarchical sense, but because they relate to life, to themselves, to others, and to reality itself in a completely different way than the vast majority of people. These are not qualities that make someone special in the ego's understanding of specialness, not achievements to be proud of or credentials to display. Rather, these are signs of a consciousness that has somehow escaped or seen through the most pervasive forms of conditioning that trap most human beings in patterns of suffering, conflict, and inauthenticity throughout their entire lives. What are these signs that indicate an extremely rare quality of being? Let us explore them together, not so you can use them to evaluate yourself or others, not so you can collect them as spiritual accomplishments, but so you can perhaps recognize in yourself or in others around you these unusual qualities and understand what they actually mean about how consciousness is functioning. These signs often make the people who embody them seem strange, difficult to understand, even problematic or dysfunctional to conventional society. Yet they point toward a freedom and authenticity that most people unconsciously long for but rarely discover. The first sign of this rare quality is a fundamental inability to accept things simply because everyone else accepts them, because authority figures proclaim them to be true, or because tradition and culture have declared them to be so for centuries. Most people, if we observe honestly, accept the vast majority of their beliefs, values, opinions, and ways of living without any real inquiry or questioning. They believe what their parents believed, what their religion teaches, what their culture assumes, what their education system transmitted to them. They adopt ready-made answers to life's deepest questions without ever genuinely investigating those questions for themselves. But the rare individual cannot do this, not because they are rebellious or contrarian by nature, but because they have an intrinsic need to understand directly, to see for themselves, to question everything until they arrive at their own truth rather than borrowed truth. This quality often appears early in childhood and creates tremendous difficulty in educational systems and social structures that demand conformity and acceptance of established knowledge. The rare child asks why repeatedly, not to be difficult, but because they genuinely need to understand. When told that something is true or right or necessary, they cannot simply accept it, but must investigate it, test it against their own experience and perception. This continues into adulthood, where they question societal norms, cultural assumptions, religious doctrines, political ideologies, scientific dogmas, not from a place of cynicism or negativity, but from genuine inquiry. They cannot live with second-hand knowledge about the most important questions of existence. They must find out for themselves what is true, what is real, what actually works, regardless of what everyone else believes or does. The second sign is a deep, almost visceral discomfort with all forms of psychological authority and the hierarchies built upon them. Most people are surprisingly comfortable with authority, even seek it out, wanting someone to tell them what to believe, how to live, what to do, what path to follow. They gravitate toward gurus, experts, leaders, systems, ideologies that promise to have the answers and show the way. But the rare individual experiences an immediate resistance when anyone claims to have special knowledge about how they should live, what they should believe, who they should become. This is not about rejecting practical expertise in technical domains or the natural respect one might have for experience and wisdom. This is specifically about psychological authority, about anyone claiming to know what is right for your consciousness, your inner life, your deepest being. This person recognizes instinctively that no one, however wise or enlightened they may appear, can possibly know what is true or right for someone else's unique consciousness and life circumstance. They see that accepting psychological authority from another, no matter how benevolent or well-intentioned, is a form of giving away your own power of direct perception and understanding. They observe how all hierarchies built on psychological authority inevitably become corrupted, how even the most genuine teachers often end up with followers who have replaced their own inquiry with dependence on the teacher's words and presence. So they remain profoundly alone in their inquiry, not because they are isolated or antisocial, but because they refuse to surrender their autonomy to any external authority about how to live and what to believe. The third sign is an unusual relationship with solitude, silence, and aloneness. Most people fear being alone with themselves, fear silence, constantly seek distraction, entertainment, noise, social engagement, anything to avoid the discomfort of simply being present to themselves without external stimulation or validation. But the rare individual not only tolerates solitude but actively seeks it, needs it, finds in it something essential and nourishing that cannot be found in the noise and constant stimulation of social life. This is not about being antisocial or misanthropic. This is about recognizing that certain essential insights, certain depths of understanding and being, can only emerge in silence and solitude when the mind is not constantly responding to external demands and stimulations. This person discovers that in silence and aloneness, something becomes possible that is never possible in the noise and distraction of constant social engagement. They can observe their own consciousness clearly, watch how thoughts arise and dissolve, see patterns that remain invisible in the rush of daily life. They can touch something deeper than the personality, something more fundamental than their conditioning. They often need significant periods of solitude to maintain their connection to this depth, and they do not experience this as deprivation, but as essential nourishment. Others may see them as withdrawn, isolating, perhaps even depressed, but for them, this solitude is not withdrawal from life, but engagement with something more real and alive than most social interaction provides. The fourth sign is an almost complete lack of interest in comparing themselves with others or competing for status, recognition, success, or any of the markers of achievement that drive most people's behavior. Most human beings are caught in constant comparison, constantly measuring themselves against others to determine their worth, their standing, their success. They compete for position, recognition, accumulation, achievement, driven by the need to be better than, to be ahead of, to be superior to others in some domain. But the rare individual simply does not operate from this comparative, competitive consciousness. They are not trying to be better than anyone, not competing for limited goods, not measuring their worth against others' achievements. This does not mean they lack ambition or drive in their chosen activities. They may work with tremendous dedication and intensity at whatever they do, but the motivation is intrinsic rather than comparative. They engage in activities because those activities genuinely interest them, because they find meaning and satisfaction in the work itself, not because they want to be better than others or gain recognition or prove their worth. Success and failure in the conventional sense lose their power to define them because they are not measuring themselves by external standards. This often makes them appear unmotivated or lacking in ambition to conventional people who cannot understand motivation that does not involve comparison and competition. But actually, they may be far more genuinely engaged with their activities than those driven by comparison and the need for external validation. The fifth sign is an ability to hold paradox and ambiguity without needing to resolve it into certainty, and a deep discomfort with dogma, absolute positions, or any ideology that claims to have complete answers. Most people need certainty, crave it, will accept false certainty rather than live with genuine not knowing. They align themselves with ideologies, belief systems, political positions, religious doctrines that give them the comfort of knowing what is true and right. They become identified with their positions and defend them as if their very existence depends on being right. But the rare individual is comfortable with not knowing, with ambiguity, with the complexity and mystery of existence that cannot be reduced to simple formulas or absolute truths. They observe that life is far more complex, mysterious, and paradoxical than any ideology or belief system can capture. They see that people on opposite sides of issues often both have valid points, that truth is rarely found in extreme positions, but in subtle understanding that holds multiple perspectives without needing to collapse them into one right answer. They can change their mind when presented with new information or deeper understanding without experiencing this as a threat to their identity. They do not need their beliefs to be right to feel okay about themselves. This makes them appear wishy-washy, uncommitted, or unreliable to people who live from rigid positions, but actually they are simply more interested in truth than in being right, more committed to understanding than to defending positions. The sixth sign is an unusual sensitivity to suffering, injustice, and the pain of others, combined with a recognition that you cannot save everyone or fix all the problems you perceive. Most people either become callous and numb to protect themselves from overwhelming empathy, or they become compulsive fixers and rescuers, driven by the need to make everything better, to save everyone who is suffering. But the rare individual develops a different relationship with the suffering they perceive in themselves and in the world around them. They remain sensitive, continue to feel deeply, yet develop the wisdom to recognize what they can actually influence and what they must simply witness with compassion, but without the compulsion to fix. They understand that everyone's suffering is their own to work with, that unsolicited help often does more harm than good, that enabling and rescuing often prevents the growth that comes through facing difficulties. They can be present to others' pain without taking it on as their own burden. They can care deeply while also maintaining boundaries. They can offer help when genuinely requested and appropriate while not making others' problems their identity and purpose. This requires a maturity and wisdom that is rare because it goes against both the impulse to protect yourself through emotional numbing and the impulse to define yourself through endless helping and rescuing. Most people swing between these poles, but the rare individual finds a middle way that honors both self and other without sacrificing either. The seventh sign is a particular kind of honesty that goes beyond simply not lying, extending to a fundamental authenticity in how they present themselves and relate to others. Most people, if we observe without judgment, are constantly managing their image, performing a version of themselves they think will be acceptable or impressive, hiding parts of themselves they fear will be rejected. They wear masks, play roles, present carefully curated versions of their lives, especially in the age of social media. But the rare individual has less interest in and capacity for this kind of performance, not because they are exhibitionistic or inappropriately self-revealing, but because the gap between their inner experience and outer presentation feels intolerable to them. They cannot pretend to feel what they do not feel, cannot fake enthusiasm for things that bore them, cannot present a false image of having it all together when they are actually struggling. This often gets them in trouble socially and professionally because so much of social interaction is built on polite pretense and careful image management. They may be seen as inappropriate, lacking in social skills, even rude, when actually they are simply being honest in situations where dishonesty is the accepted norm. They would rather risk rejection for being authentic than gain acceptance for being false. This does not mean they are tactless or intentionally hurtful, but they cannot maintain the exhausting performance of being someone they are not. The eighth, and perhaps most significant sign, is an ongoing, lived inquiry into the nature of consciousness itself. Not as an intellectual pursuit, but as the primary question of existence. Most people never seriously investigate the nature of their own consciousness, never question the assumption that they are a separate self, never explore the relationship between the observer and the observed, never examine the structure of thought and how it creates suffering. They take their experience of being a separate individual as an absolute given and build their entire life on that unexamined assumption. But the rare individual cannot stop questioning the nature of consciousness itself, the nature of self, the relationship between awareness and its contents. They notice how thoughts arise apparently on their own, how the sense of being a separate self is actually constructed moment by moment through identification with thoughts and feelings. They observe that what they call I changes constantly, yet something remains that observes all these changes. They investigate whether the observer and the observed are actually separate or two aspects of the same movement of consciousness. They explore the nature of suffering and discover that it always involves resistance to what is, always requires a sense of separate self that wants reality to be different than it is. This inquiry is not a weekend workshop or occasional spiritual practice, but an ongoing, passionate exploration that shapes their entire relationship with life. They are genuinely interested in understanding consciousness itself, not to gain something or become enlightened in some future time, but because the question itself is alive and urgent in them. These 8 signs, when present together, create a very unusual human being, someone who often does not fit well into conventional society, who may struggle to find their place, who may be seen as difficult or problematic by those operating from conventional consciousness. They may appear to be underachieving by conventional standards because they are not driven by comparison and competition. They may seem uncommitted or unreliable because they will not align with ideologies or accept authorities. They may be seen as antisocial because they need significant solitude. They may be judged as weird or inappropriate because they cannot maintain the social performances others manage easily. They may appear indecisive or weak because they hold ambiguity rather than taking rigid positions. They may be criticized as not caring enough or caring too much about others' suffering without finding the conventional balance. They may be seen as too intense or serious because they are always investigating consciousness itself rather than just living unreflectively. Yet these rare individuals often have access to something most people never touch: genuine authenticity. Real freedom from psychological conditioning, direct perception of reality rather than filtered through beliefs and assumptions, relationship with existence that is immediate rather than mediated through ideology and authority. They live with a quality of aliveness, presence, and authenticity that is rare because it requires something most people are unwilling to do: question everything, reject all authority about how to live, endure the discomfort of not knowing, face reality without the comforting buffers of belief and ideology, remain sensitive while developing wisdom, be authentic even when it costs acceptance and success. If you recognize these qualities in yourself, you may have spent years wondering what is wrong with you, why you do not fit in, why you cannot just accept what everyone else accepts and be comfortable like everyone else seems to be. But perhaps nothing is wrong with you. Perhaps you are simply among the rare few who cannot help but question, who cannot live with second-hand truth, who cannot perform inauthenticity, who must understand consciousness itself. This path is not easy, often not rewarded by conventional success or social acceptance, but it is the path of genuine inquiry and authentic living. And if you recognize these qualities in someone else, perhaps you can appreciate that their difficulty fitting in, their questioning of everything, their need for solitude, their refusal to accept authority, their discomfort with ideology, their unusual honesty, are not defects or problems to be fixed, but signs of a rare consciousness that is precious and valuable precisely because it is so unusual in a world of conformity, pretense, and unexamined living. The question is not whether you possess these qualities, not whether you can claim to be among the rare few, because that very claim would be the ego trying to make itself special. The question is whether genuine inquiry is alive in you, whether you can observe your own consciousness without judgment, whether you can live with authenticity even when it is difficult, whether you can question everything, including the questioner itself, whether you can remain open to truth wherever it leads, rather than where you want it to go. This is what makes consciousness rare and precious. Not the possession of special qualities, but the living inquiry into the nature of existence itself.